Sure, my arm is down. Yes, looks like we are live. So, because I'm an idiot and didn't do this prior to going live, I need to pull up the video we will be taking a look at here. 10 questions for atheists in 2021. That is what we need. Beautiful. Give me a second here. I'm going to play through this ad so that when I pull the video up, we'll be ready to just jump right into the video. Alrighty, there's that. Let me get the share screen going. Let's go. Do I want to do a window or a Chrome tab? Let's do a Chrome tab. There we go. We'll go full screen. And what the hell was that? That was my phone. Alrighty. So, 10 questions for atheists in 2021. Let's see what they are. Because just like the last 10 questions for atheists video that Braxton Hunter did, I didn't watch it in advance. And I haven't watched this one in advance. And I almost forgot that because Digital Gnosis and Nathan and James Fodor did a, I don't want to call it a review, but they answered the questions. And I started watching it and then realized, wait, I'm doing my own video on this. I don't want to know what the questions are in advance or what anybody's responses to them are. So about 30, 40 seconds into that video, I was like, I can't watch this until after I do my own. So let's jump right in here, shall we? You know what? Give me just a second. I don't know if I clicked the share audio button when I did this. So I might have, but just in case I didn't, I do want to go back in here. Share tab audio. Yes. Alrighty. So, all right, let's continue.
Last year, I made a video, 10 Questions for Atheists. That's in a playlist that has 12 episodes as I listened to what atheists said and then interacted with that. There were a lot of responses, and I still get responses to this day from that video. Now, admittedly, there were some things in that video that might have been tongue-in-cheek, but I genuinely wanted to hear the answers to those questions. Quite a few atheists seem to appreciate that I was trying to understand their positions in a greater way. But
I did want to comment on that. I don't think that when Braxton asked us questions that he was doing it condescendingly or pretentiously. Yeah, like he said, something, he might have been a little tongue-in-cheek, maybe a little hyperbolic or facetious with some of the stuff that he said, but ultimately he was asking serious questions. And I think that he was asking serious questions, and I think that they were genuine. I think that he was asking them, and I think this is why he's doing it again, as a way of allowing the atheist community to respond in the hopes that he and maybe other theists or maybe even other atheists can better understand the positions of those in the atheist community. I did also want to say that I know there are some atheists out there that I wouldn't say are upset that Braxton has made this this video, but have said, oh, well, we shouldn't really respond to this. This is just, we're just feeding him content and, putting his name out there. And well, sure we are. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, though, because at the same time, that we're producing content for Braxton, he's also producing content for us, because if he hadn't made this video, I wouldn't be live right now doing a response to it. I also think that it helps open up. It helps initiate a dialogue about these questions, because I do think that a dialogue between the theists and the atheists, I think, is good, and I think that a lot more atheists need to be more open to that dialogue, and I think that a lot of them also need to be a little bit more honest in that dialogue as well.
Many still didn't think my questions were genuine. A lot of people also thought that I was too wordy for the question to come out in a precise way. So here I'm asking these questions as simply and concisely as I possibly can, and without any snark whatsoever. I genuinely want to know the answers to these questions. Question 1. If you have a deconversion story from any world religion, would you mind sharing that story? If you grew up in a non-religious household, what was it like to experience being around other people who were raised religious? Question number 2.
Alrighty, I didn't know how long the my first question was going to go for. So yeah, and I don't know if Braxton will watch specifically my video. I doubt it, but just because the question was asked, my deconversion story, I actually, and I'll have to do it probably after the live stream is over. I'll add I'll add the link to my journey to atheism video that I did, which really goes much more in depth into how I deconverted. I don't really like that word, but that's the word I'm going to use. It doesn't really matter. I'm just going to use that word. But largely speaking, or rather broadly speaking, as I continued to delve into the depths of science, primarily physics, astrophysics, cosmology, quantum mechanics, things like that, as well as philosophy, and trying to understand these things from a philosophical perspective, I just started to ask myself questions. Either that, or I started to examine certain questions that I was asking myself from a different perspective. And it really started to open up some, what I would now refer to as holes in theism, some problems, some what I would argue are quite serious problems that it has if it wants to contend on the stage as a major worldview. But like I said, after the live stream is done, I will put a link to the actual video that I did talking about my journey to atheism, so that we can get through this a little bit more quickly.
Is there anything that Christian apologists or philosophers bring that you actually do consider to be good evidence for God? And if not, how do you define evidence? Straightforward.
Okay. So the question is essentially, is there evidence? Do you consider anything that's out there that has ever been proposed to be, as I would understand it, to any degree, would you consider it evidence? It could be good. You could think it's good evidence or bad evidence. Would you call it evidence? And I would say, probably to the surprise of a lot of atheists, and contrary to what I've said in the past, because we learn, and as we learn more, our positions change, that there is evidence for theism. I just think that, well, first off, I don't think that there's such a thing as bad evidence. I think that evidence analytically or intrinsically has to be good. What does it mean for something to be evidence for something but be bad? I just, that makes no sense, but that's a philosophical rabbit hole I'm not going all the way down right now. So I prefer, the only qualifications I think are that one can aptly apply to evidence would be strong or weak. I don't think good or bad are good qualifiers for the word evidence. I think strong and weak would be the best. So just to give a quick example on that, if you saw me walking down the street and you heard like a metal jingling in my pocket, that is evidence that there are keys in my pocket. But I don't think we could say it's strong evidence that there's keys in my pocket, because it could be coins, it could be jewelry, it could be nails, it could be a variety of metal things that aren't keys. All you can say is that there is evidence that there are keys in my pocket, but it isn't strong evidence that there's keys in my pocket. So that's how I would that's how I would differentiate between saying that something is strong or weak evidence. If you got a closer look and you noticed that whatever was jingling in my pocket was circular, well, now I would say you have strong evidence that there's coins in my pocket, because coins will jingle as a metal would, and they're also circular. And coins, we also know, are a thing that people put in their pocket. So that's the difference between strong and weak evidence. I would say that there is weak evidence for theism, but I would also say that the evidence for a non-theist view, particularly for me, an atheist view, the view that there is no God, has more evidence, and more of that evidence is stronger and aligns with what we observe about our reality without having to make as many assumptions. And I think that part of a strong worldview is not just that it's got good evidence, but that in order for it to match up with what we see about our reality, we don't have to make quite as many assumptions about what it is. And I would argue that for atheism, I personally, I would take it a step further and just say naturalism. I would say that naturalism intrinsically simpler than theism, which I think makes it more likely than theism, but I think it also requires significantly less assumptions than theism does. And so I would argue that both of those, while not being direct evidence for naturalism, I do think increase the prior probability of naturalism over theism.
I'm a dog person. Here's my dog, Indiana.
So I guess just to answer that last question, yes, I would say that there is evidence for God's existence. I would say that broadly speaking, at least it's weak evidence, and that there is simply much more evidence for atheism, and much more of that evidence is stronger.
Dogs, cats, both, or neither? Did Jesus...
Well, I like both, to be honest. But I have a preference for cats. That's just because I prefer lower maintenance animals, and dogs are generally higher maintenance than cats are. So I would say I like both. We have both in the house right now. I've lived around both my entire life, but I do have a slight personal preference towards cats.
Jesus exists as a single historical individual? And if so, how reasonable do you think it is for people to hold the position that Jesus did not exist? I'm your Christian.
So, excuse me. Let me get a quick drink here. I am not a biblical scholar. I am not an ancient Near Eastern scholar or archaeologist. I am not an Assyriologist. I am not an antiquities expert. I'm not an anthropologist or a paleontologist or anything dealing with particularly that era or those regions. So all I can do is take what the academic literature that we currently have available and the empirical literature that we have available on this matter is, and examine that and juxtapose that with the conclusion, or the position rather, of the experts and the professionals relevant to that specialized field. And overwhelmingly, the consensus is that there was a historical Jesus, even if we don't know much about his life or what he did. That there was certainly a person here, a real person this story was based off of, is the overwhelming conclusion of the professionals, excuse me, as well as the empirical literature and the academic literature that is available to us. In terms of the reasonability of the position that there was no historical Jesus, often referred to as Jesus mythicism, I don't think it's reasonable to hold to that position any more than I think it's reasonable to hold to creationism, or any more than I think it's reasonable to hold that COVID-19 vaccines aren't safe, any more than I think it's reasonable to hold to the position that the climate is not drastically changing and that change isn't being driven by humans. The academic literature and the data that we have available disagrees with those positions, and the overwhelming expert consensus aligns with that data in disagreement with that position. And so I think that certainly non-professionals, if they want to be reasonable, ought to align themselves with where the academic literature and the expert consensus points us, which is to the conclusion that there was a historical Jesus. And the only real arguments that I hear against what I've just said is, oh, well, that's an argument from authority, and it's not. An argument from authority can't be committed by citing the consensus. That's not how that fallacy works. I've also heard, oh, well, I just had to clear my throat there really quickly. Oh, these are just all these scholars, these Christian scholars are all Christians. They have to do statements of faith. Actually, no. Scholars, even if they are Christian, that are working at, say, Harvard University or the University of Cambridge or the University of Oxford, who are biblical scholars, don't have to sign statements of faith to work there. Number one, that's just false. Number two, them being Christian does not inherently or intrinsically mean that they are biased. That's an appeal to bias fallacy, and that actually is a fallacy. Also, this objection, in my mind, is no more reasonable or applicable than when creationists go, we can't listen to what all the experts in biology say. They're all these secular, liberal academics. They can't be trusted. It's nothing more than an appeal to bias fallacy. It's, the reason that all the experts disagree with me is because they're all just biased. It couldn't possibly be that I'm just probably incorrect. So I don't. To me, I don't know really where Jesus mythicists have to go here. It doesn't seem to me that they have. Yeah, as Immutable says in the comments, it's just poor. It just seems that they have poor argumentation. So yeah, I would say that Jesus, it seems that the most likely, the most reasonable conclusion is that there was a historical Jesus, and that the position that there wasn't. I guess I can't directly say that it's unreasonable, but I don't think it's any more reasonable than being a creationist.
Friends and family members, which one would stand the best chance of convincing you or persuading you than the others? Even if you think none of them stand a chance, some stand more of a chance than others, right? Who would that be and why? What's your favorite film?
It would be, for me, it would probably have to be the person who's already, or not already, because I'm not a Christian, but who at one point, they didn't really convert me, but they definitely contributed heavily to strengthening my faith. And that was William Lane Craig. I also admired John Lennox, who's a mathematician at the University of Oxford. He was somebody that I admired as well. So those two, I think, would probably be the most, simply because of the respect that I still have for both of them, even though I disagree strongly with both of them. I would say that those two are probably the most likely to end up convincing me, if anybody.
Film or television series? Contingency arguments for God's existence.
My favorite film? My favorite film, I would say, is Snatch. And I know that, I don't know if he's still in the chat, but Jefferson Spatchcock knows what movie I'm talking about. That's probably my favorite movie. My favorite television series is probably The Curse of Oak Island, just because I like a lot of the historicity in it. I like the mystery behind it, and I like the sense of adventure. And you're searching for this supposed treasure. There's a mystery involved with it, and it's just slowly unraveling. And there's so many directions it could go. So that, yeah, my favorite film is Snatched, and my favorite TV series is The Curse of Oak Island.
Can be framed in a number of ways, obviously, but pick one. And what's your favorite response to this sort of contingency argument? Or if you're really ambitious, what's your favorite response to contingency arguments in general?
So for those who don't know, let me get a drink here. So for those who surprisingly don't know, the contingency arguments are arguments that essentially ask the question, why is there something rather than nothing? And through complex philosophical argumentation, try to arrive at the conclusion that there must be some sort of necessary being that which all contingent things depend on, and that this being is God. My response to contingency arguments would be that, well, sure, if we're going to grant that there has to be something necessary there, I would argue that it's the universe, simply because we know that the universe exists, and it doesn't seem, at least thus far, that the universe would be the kind of thing that couldn't or can't exist. But I don't even think one needs to make that argument. I think one could just say that, well, I think I reject the principle of sufficient reason, because the contingency arguments, generally speaking at least, rely heavily on the principle of sufficient reason, that there has to be a sufficient reason for the, I guess you could say, the ontological nature of something, what something is and why it is the way that it is and why it even exists at all. There has to be a sufficient reason for it, or at least there's likely to be sufficient reasons for them. And that depends on if you go strong PSR versus weak PSR. If one wants to make that distinction, personally, I would go weak PSR. But generally, the principle of sufficient reason is given in terms of everything has to have some sort of sufficient reason for its ontological nature or its metaphysical nature. And I would say that I reject that. I would need to see the argument for that. There seem to be things that we can observe, that whether they be events or objects, that don't seem to have like a sufficient reason for why it is that it just is, and that's all. So I think one could argue reasonably that the universe is just a brute contingency. It just it exists. I often say that the universe just exists simpliciter. It, it exists with no further qualification or condition. As Carl Sagan once famously said, the universe just is. And that's all.
On your understanding of Christianity, what does it take for a person to become a Christian and experience everlasting life? Whether you think anything.
That is a tough one, because I mean the various denominations disagree about this. But having been raised Catholic, I would go with what Catholicism would say, that belief is important, but is not necessarily what's going to get you into heaven. That stewardship and being a good person, especially tied with strong faith, is your best bet to getting into heaven. Ooh, excuse me.
In the Bible is true or not. Do you think that the Bible or any passage in the Bible seems to teach eternal conscious suffering in hell? Maybe you think it teaches universal ultimate salvation or annihilation, the idea that people will no longer be conscious, but will be annihilated and no longer have a conscious experience of anything. And I should say, I'm partly asking that question because a friend of mine, Chris Date at Rethinking Hell, would be happy to have a discussion or a debate on the subject of whether any Bible passage teaches eternal conscious torment. What do you think is the most dangerous?
Well, so with those, it's really hard, because ultimately it's going to come down to how somebody interprets the various parts of the Bible. And it also is going to come down to thereby which particular denomination that you're adhering to, because they're going to have different interpretations of the Bible, and thereby different interpretations of what happens, after death. So I can't really answer that question.
Dangerous or problematic issue that theologically conservative Christians hold to. And I'm talking about an issue or a position, not a person, a movement, or a party. Well, that's the list for 2021.
So with that question, it's hard. I think broadly it's just the bigotry. I think that the biggest issue with conservative Christianity, primarily in the United States today, is that they're not really Christians. They're just a bunch of bigots who use Christianity as sort of a facade to not only try to hide but justify their bigotry, that it's okay for them to be bigoted and hateful against groups of people and certain demographics of people because Jesus taught me I can do that, because the Bible says, and that's all it is. I mean, when you break down why, give me a moral argument for the immorality of homosexuality. It's always more a theological argument that almost always reduces to, well, because the Bible says that it is. And that's that. And to me, it's just poor argumentation. He said that's that. Have we really gotten through all 10 questions already? Perhaps we have.
Thanks for taking the time to watch the video, and I sure hope you will respond in the comments or make your own video in response. I'd love to hear what you have to say, because I genuinely want the answers to these questions. Thanks for showing up, and I'll see you next time on Trinity Radio.
Alrighty, we can stop that. Yeah, I did go a little bit more quickly than I would have thought it was going to go. Of course, he did say he was going to be a little bit more succinct and direct with the questions, which I thought it was just fine the first time. I know a lot of people don't like questions that kind of get drawn out, and I do think there are instances where they don't need to be if it's an explicitly close-ended question. But I do think that there are times where explicating or elucidating on a question you're asking can be important, because it can it can put the question in the right context. It can preserve certain technicalities or certain nuances that people might otherwise gloss over. It can ensure that somebody understands what it is exactly that you're asking, and that's where context is a big picture there. But I disagree with Braxton on a lot, but I do have respect for the guy. I can't say I've ever had any issues with him. I think he's one of the better apologists out there. And I appreciate him for taking the time to listen to a lot of the responses and then release another video, trying to get at the root of what it was that he was asking and trying to really understand his opponent better. And I think that it shows that honestly, that he probably is, that there is a level of genuity behind him asking these questions, that he really is trying to understand what it is atheists believe, and the reasons why. And I think that's a good thing, because I have to be honest, I think that a lot of atheists aren't very forthcoming with what it is that they believe and why. And I think that that's really evident in the fact that for them, they try to make it something that's not even a belief, that's not even a position at all. But then they want to normalize it, and they want people to come to it. But if it's not a position, what is it that you're offering people? What is it that you're trying to normalize? And that's where I see the confusion in the atheism, as it seems to be broadly on the internet today, is that it seems they don't want it to be a position. They don't want it to be a worldview. They don't want it to be a thing that you're offering somebody. It's a lack of all of those things. And that makes no sense to me. But I'm going to let you guys know. Stay tuned, because I do have some content coming out, hopefully within the next week or so, a response video to a channel I've been watching a lot lately, and a channel that I've come to like because I like the host of the channel. So if you're interested in some more direct science content, be sure to stay tuned. And with that, per causam nos perfectum, or through reason we progress.